The ledger sat open on her desk, ink still wet from the copy she'd just finished. Georgia Hayes had been copying plantation records for 12 years across 7 counties in Virginia, and she'd learned early to keep her face neutral, her hand steady, no matter what words passed beneath her pen. Estate inventories, probate documents, bills of sale, they were all just numbers and names to the white clerks who hired her. But to Georgia, every line told a story. Every entry was a life reduced to monetary value, a human being transformed into property by the stroke of a pen. But this entry was different. This one made her hand freeze mid-stroke, the quill trembling slightly above the paper. 23 children, all under age 10, listed in the estate of a deceased planter named Cornelius Draper. The descriptions were meticulous, detailed in a way that seemed almost obsessive. Female child, age 7, hair color flaxen, eyes of clearest blue, complexion as fair as cream. Another, male child, age 6, features delicate and refined, skin without blemish, hair golden in sunlight. And another, female child, age 9, countenance angelic, complexion pale as porcelain, demeanor gentle and cultured. Reading them, you would think the document described the children of wealthy plantation owners. But stamped in the margin beside each entry, in bold, unmistakable letters, was that single word, property. Georgia had copied hundreds of estate inventories. She'd seen enslaved people described in every possible way, by height, by strength, by skill, by health. But she'd never seen descriptions quite like these. These children were being described the way you'd describe a painting or a piece of fine china. And their values, $800, $900, even $200 for a 10-year-old girl, were astronomical. A prime field hand in his 20s might sell for that much. These were children who couldn't perform significant labor. She finished copying the document in silence, her mind racing. When she submitted the work to the Hanover County clerk 2 days later, she asked, carefully, casually, as if merely curious, about the unusually high values. The clerk barely glanced up from his desk. Draper specialized in fancy stock, always did fetch premiums. Nothing unusual about it. Fancy stock. Georgia knew what that meant. She'd heard the term whispered in the quarters, spoken with a mixture of fear and disgust by the enslaved women who worked in Richmond's wealthy households. Fancy stock meant enslaved people sold for their appearance rather than their labor. Light-skinned women sold to wealthy men. Beautiful children sold to households where they'd be displayed like ornaments. But 23 children, all under 10, all described with such careful attention to their European features. Georgia returned to her small room in Richmond's free black neighborhood that evening and did something she'd never done before. She opened a new notebook, one she'd purchased with her own money, not the ledgers provided by the county clerks, and she copied the entries again. Every child, every description, every value. She didn't know why. She just knew that something about those entries felt wrong in a way that went beyond the ordinary horror of slavery. 2 weeks later, she was hired to copy records in Chesterfield County. Another estate inventory, another deceased planter. This one had died in a riding accident, leaving behind a substantial property that included 17 enslaved people. Georgia's pen moved steadily across the page, copying names and values, and then she reached the section listing the children. 5 of them. Ages 4 through 9. Complexion nearly white, hair of spun gold, eyes blue as summer sky, features delicate and refined, bearing no mark of African descent. Property, all of them. She felt her heart begin to race. Her hand continued copying, but her mind was calculating. 2 estates, 2 different counties, 2 different planters who died within months of each other. 28 children total, all described in strikingly similar language. It could be coincidence. Virginia had plenty of mixed-race children born into slavery. The system itself ensured that. But the sheer number, the consistent language, the extraordinary values, something about it felt deliberate. That night, she added the 5 new names to her private notebook. She wrote the planter's name, the date of death, the county, the names of the executors handling the estate. She told herself she was just being thorough, that it was simply her habit as a copier to keep meticulous records. But deep down, she knew she was looking for a pattern. Before we continue with the story of what Georgia Hayes discovered in those hidden ledgers and the dangerous web of secrets that would nearly cost her everything, make sure to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Drop a comment below telling us which state or city you're listening from, because this story spans across Virginia, but similar horrors were happening throughout the American South in the 1840s and 1850s. Let's discover together what Georgia uncovered in those forgotten records. Georgia Hayes was not a woman given to flights of fancy or wild speculation. She'd built her life on precision, on the careful measurement of ink to paper, word to meaning. Her father, Marcus Hayes, had purchased his own freedom in 1798, working for 23 years to save enough money to buy himself, then his wife, then eventually his 3 children out of bondage. He taught Georgia that freedom was something you built brick by brick through discipline and caution and the careful avoidance of anything that might draw dangerous attention. Keep your head down, he'd told her when she was young. Do your work well. Make yourself valuable but never indispensable. Indispensable people become targets. He died when Georgia was 17, and she'd followed his advice ever since. She ran her copying business with quiet efficiency, charging fair rates, never complaining, never asking questions that might make white officials uncomfortable. She lived in a modest room, dressed plainly, attended church regularly, and maintained the kind of invisible respectability that allowed a free black woman to move through Virginia's administrative systems without attracting scrutiny. But now, sitting in her room with her private notebook spread before her, she was violating every principle her father had taught her. She was asking questions. She was looking for patterns. She was paying attention to things that powerful men clearly wanted, handled discreetly. By the end of 1849, her notebook contained 42 names. 42 children, ages 3 to 11, all described with careful attention to their light skin, European features and refined appearance. All valued at prices that made no economic sense for child laborers, all appearing in the estates of wealthy planters who died suddenly or unexpectedly. Georgia began mapping it out. She drew a chart showing the counties: Hanover, Chesterfield, Goochland, Henrico, Prince George, Dinwiddie, Powhatan. She listed the planters' names: Draper, Fairchild, Harrison, Talbot, Winchester, Bryant, Saunders. She noted the dates of death and the names of the estate executors, and slowly, connections began to emerge. 4 of the planters had been members of the same agricultural society, the Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical Society, an organization of wealthy landowners who met quarterly to discuss farming techniques and livestock breeding. 3 had served together in the state legislature in the early 1840s. 2 were connected through marriage, distant cousins whose wives had been sisters. It could still be coincidence. Virginia's planter elite was a small, interconnected world. But Georgia's instincts, honed by 12 years of reading between the lines of legal documents, told her this was something else. She needed more information, but she couldn't ask questions directly, couldn't show too much interest in any particular estate or planter. She needed to be strategic, so she expanded her business. She sent letters to county clerks in neighboring regions, offering her copying services at rates slightly below her usual fee. She emphasized her speed, her accuracy, her discretion. Within 3 months, she had contracts with courthouses in 8 additional counties, and wherever she went, she looked for the same pattern: estate inventories, children described as nearly white, unusually high values. She found it in Petersburg, in Suffolk, in Lynchburg, in Farmville. By the spring of 1850, her private notebook contained 97 names. Georgia had become certain now. This wasn't random. This wasn't just the ordinary horror of light-skinned children born into slavery and sold for high prices because of their appearance. This was organized, systematic. There were too many of them, appearing in too many estates that shared too many connections. But she still didn't understand the mechanism. How were these children being produced? Why did they only appear in certain estates? And why were they being sold so quickly after the planter's death? She needed to talk to someone who'd been inside the system, someone who'd seen what happened on these plantations. It took her 2 months to work up the courage to approach Grace. Grace worked in the household of Malcolm Preston, a wealthy Richmond merchant who prided himself on his progressive approach to slavery. He allowed his enslaved workers to hire out their own time on Sundays, to earn small amounts of money, to move around Richmond streets with limited supervision. Preston believed this made him enlightened. In reality, it just meant he was extracting labor 7 days a week instead of 6, while maintaining the fiction that he was somehow different from other slaveholders. Grace was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed and careful. Georgia had noticed her at the market several times, had seen the way she evaluated people, calculating risks and opportunities with the practiced assessment of someone who'd survived by reading situations correctly. On a warm morning in May 1850, Georgia positioned herself near the fish vendors, examining the day's catch with apparent casualness. When Grace approached to select fish for the Preston household, Georgia spoke quietly, her voice barely audible over the market noise. "I need information about children, light-skinned children, the ones they sell south." Grace's hand paused for just a fraction of a second over the fish, then continued moving. Her face showed nothing. "Why?" "Because I'm finding too many of them in estate records, too many in estates that are connected to each other, and I think someone needs to know about it." Grace finished selecting her fish, paid the vendor, then moved to the next stall. Georgia followed, maintaining a careful distance. After several more purchases, Grace finally spoke, her voice low and controlled. "Second African Baptist Church. Sunday, after the second service ends, go to the basement and wait." Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd with her basket of purchases. Georgia spent the days until Sunday in a state of nervous anticipation. She'd crossed a line. She'd moved from passive observation to active investigation. If anyone found out, if Grace mentioned it to the wrong person, if someone saw them meeting, but she had to know. The names in her notebook had become more than entries to her. They were children, real children with faces and voices and lives, reduced to property descriptions and sale values. And something was being done to them, something systematic and deliberate that went beyond even the normal cruelties of the slave system. Sunday came. Georgia attended the morning service at First African Baptist, her usual church, then walked to Second African Baptist for the second service. The basement was used for Sunday school and community meetings, and after the service ended, a few people lingered there talking in small groups. Georgia positioned herself in a corner, waiting. Grace arrived with 2 other women. One was younger, maybe 25, with sharp features and cautious eyes. The other was older, perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of worn dignity that comes from surviving decades of impossible situations. They sat in the corner with Georgia, their voices barely above whispers. The younger woman was named Phyllis. She worked in a household in Henrico County. The older woman was Sarah. She'd worked on plantations in 3 different counties before being sold to a Richmond family. "You said you're finding records," Grace began. "How many?" 97 children, ages 3 to 11, all described as light-skinned or white-appearing, all in estates of planters who died in the last 2 years, all sold south through specific dealers. The 3 women exchanged glances. Sarah spoke first, her voice heavy with something that might have been resignation or rage. Georgia couldn't tell which. "It's been happening for 20 years, maybe longer. They don't talk about it openly, but everybody in the quarters knows. If you're a woman with light skin, if you have children who come out looking white, you pray you're never noticed. Because if they decide you're useful for the program, your life becomes something else entirely." "What program?" Georgia's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. They don't call it that. They don't call it anything, really. But there are planters, 8, maybe 10 of them, who've worked out an arrangement. They identify women with the right coloring, the right features, European-looking. They keep them separate from the regular field hands, give them better quarters, better food, and they— Sarah paused, searching for words that wouldn't make the horror too explicit. They use them deliberately, for breeding children who'll look white. Georgia felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd suspected something like this, but hearing it stated so plainly was different. The children are raised separately too, Phyllis added. Special quarters, away from the main slave population. They're fed better, taught to speak properly, trained in household skills. Also, they'll develop what buyers call refined characteristics. And when the planter dies? Georgia asked, though she already suspected the answer. The children get sold, Grace said. Fast. Within weeks of the estate going to probate, there are dealers who specialize in this, the fancy trade they call it. The children go to New Orleans, Charleston, sometimes Mobile. They're sold as house servants, but— She shook her head. That's not really what they're bought for. How do the dealers know when to expect them? Advance arrangements. The planters work with specific dealers. When a child reaches 4 or 5, old enough to travel, young enough to be trainable, they get listed in the estate paperwork with special notations. The dealers watch for those estates to enter probate, then they send buyers to the auctions. Georgia thought about the notation she'd seen in some of the records. Per agreement, LS. Do the initials LS mean anything to you? All 3 women stiffened. Sarah's face went pale. Laurent Savard, she said quietly. New Orleans dealer. He's been running this trade for years, has connections all through Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. If you've seen his initials in estate records, then you're looking at the center of the whole operation. Georgia pulled out her notebook, hands trembling slightly. I need to know more. Names, plantations, anything you can tell me about how this works. What she learned over the next hour made her want to weep. The system was elegant in its cruelty. The planters involved, men named Draper, Fairchild, Harrison, Talbot, Winchester, Bryant, Saunders, and at least 3 others, had developed what amounted to a breeding program starting in the 1830s. They selected enslaved women with lighter skin and European features, isolated them in special quarters on their plantations, and used them to produce children who could pass for white. The women had no choice. Resistance meant sale, separation from other children, or worse. The children born from these arrangements were kept separate from the general slave population, given better food and housing, and trained carefully. They learned to speak without dialect, to move with refinement, to perform household tasks with precision. All so they'd be more valuable when sold. They treat it like breeding horses, Phyllis said bitterly. Improving the stock, they call it. Making premium merchandise. The children were never sold before age 4, too young to survive the transport south, and rarely after age 12. By then, their parentage might become obvious in other ways, or they'd developed enough awareness to be difficult. The sweet spot was ages 5 through 10, old enough to be useful, young enough to be molded. When a planter died, the children would be listed in the estate inventory with careful descriptions emphasizing their appearance. Special notations would alert dealers like Laurent Savard that these children were available. Within weeks, buyers would arrive at the estate auctions with instructions to purchase specific children, no matter the cost. Where do they go? Georgia asked. Everywhere, Sarah said. New Orleans mostly. Rich men buy them for their households. Some go to Charleston, to families who want servants who look like status symbols. I've heard of some going as far as Cuba or Brazil. Once they're sold south, we never hear from them again. Do the mothers know what's going to happen? Grace's laugh was harsh. Of course they know. That's the worst part. They raise these children knowing that around age 4 or 5, someone's going to come and take them away. They watch them get loaded onto wagons, sent south, and that's it. Gone forever. Why hasn't anyone reported this? All 3 women looked at Georgia with expressions that mixed pity and frustration. Report it to who? Phyllis asked. It's not illegal, enslaved people are property. Property owners can breed them however they want, sell them to whoever they want. The law doesn't care. The white folks who know about it either profit from it or look the other way. And the rest of the world, they don't want to know. It's easier to pretend slavery is just about cotton and tobacco, not about systematically breeding children to sell as human ornaments. Georgia sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing this. She'd known slavery was evil, that was beyond question. But she'd underestimated the calculated nature of its cruelty, the way it could transform human reproduction into an industrial process. "I have 97 names," she said finally. "Children documented in estate records over the last 2 years. I have the planters' names, the counties, the sale values, but I need more. I need to document this going back further. I need to show it's systematic, not random." "Why?" Grace asked, not challenging, just curious. "What are you going to do with this information?" "I don't know yet, but someone needs to have it. Someone needs to remember. Even if we can't stop it, we can bear witness. We can make sure this isn't forgotten." Sarah reached out and gripped George's hand. "Be careful. These are powerful men. They have connections to sheriffs, judges, legislators. If they find out someone's investigating them, that someone will disappear just as thoroughly as those children do." "I'll be careful," Georgia promised. But she didn't stop. Over the following months, she expanded her research. She traveled to counties she'd never worked in before, offering her copying services at reduced rates just to gain access to the archives. She went back through probate records from the 1830s and early 1840s, documenting every estate that fit the pattern. She learned to recognize the code words: fancy girl, premium child, refined features, superior complexion. These weren't just descriptions, they were signals to dealers that these children were part of the special merchandise. She found Laurent Savard's name or initials in dozens of documents: bills of sale, transport records, correspondence between estate executors and New Orleans dealers. Savard wasn't just buying children randomly. He had standing arrangements with Virginia planters to purchase specific children at specific times. By the end of 1850, Georgia's private notebook contained 137 names. She'd traced the network back to 1833 and found evidence it had been operating continuously for at least 17 years. She'd identified 12 planters who were certainly involved, and another 6 she strongly suspected based on the pattern of their estate inventories. She'd also begun to notice something else. The planters involved in this network shared more than just business connections. Many belonged to the same agricultural societies and political organizations. Several were Freemasons, members of lodges in Richmond and Petersburg. They witnessed each other's wills, served as executors for each other's estates, married into each other's families. This wasn't just a business arrangement. It was a network. A brotherhood built on the deliberate breeding and sale of children who looked white but were trapped in slavery. Georgia started keeping 2 notebooks. One was her working ledger, which she updated constantly with new information. The other was a clean copy, organized by county and year, with careful annotations showing the connections between planters, dealers, and sales. She hid the working ledger in the false bottom of her sewing basket. The clean copy she sent to a free black family in Philadelphia she'd corresponded with about genealogy research. She didn't tell them what it was, just asked them to keep it safe, sealed, and unopened, unless something happened to her. In January of 1851, Georgia took another risk. She began asking discreet questions of the county clerks she worked with, men who'd known her for years, who trusted her discretion. She'd finish copying a set of documents, then mention casually, "I noticed several children in the Draper estate inventory with unusually high values. Was that a clerical error?" Or, "The Fairchild estate sold several children to a New Orleans dealer within 2 weeks of probate opening. Is that standard procedure?" Most clerks dismissed her questions with vague answers. Administrative details, market fluctuations, nothing unusual. But one clerk, A young man named Daniel Foster in Powhatan County gave her a strange look when she asked about the speed of certain sales. "You're observant," he said quietly. "Most copiers don't pay attention to the details like that." "It's my job to pay attention," Georgia replied carefully. Foster glanced around his empty office, then lowered his voice. "There are arrangements. I'm not supposed to know about them, but you notice things when you process enough estate papers. Certain planters, certain children, certain dealers. The sales happen fast because they're planned in advance." "Planned how?" "Before the planter dies sometimes. They leave instructions with their executors. Contact dealer Savard immediately upon my death. Ensure children are sold within 30 days of probate." That sort of thing. It's all legal, so nobody questions it. But it's definitely organized. "Do other people know?" Foster shrugged. "I'm sure some do, but it's not the kind of thing anyone talks about openly. He struggled for words. "It's uncomfortable. Easier to just process the papers and not think too hard about what they mean." Georgia thanked him and finished her work. But as she walked back to Richmond that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting close to something dangerous. She'd moved beyond passive documentation. She was actively investigating now, asking questions, connecting pieces. And if Daniel Foster had noticed her interest, others might too. She was right to be worried. In March of 1851, Georgia arrived at the Henrico County Courthouse for her regular copying work and found the chief clerk, a man named William Graves, waiting for her with an unusual request. "Miss Hayes, I need you to copy a special set of documents, private estate records not for public filing. The family wants personal copies, but doesn't want them handled by my regular clerks." It wasn't an unusual request. Wealthy families sometimes wanted sensitive documents copied by someone outside the regular courthouse staff. Georgia followed Graves to a back office where he laid out a folder of papers. "Copy these exactly. Don't add anything to your standard billing. This is off the record." Georgia nodded and began working. The documents were estate papers for a planter named Robert Harrison, recently deceased. Standard inventory, lists of property, financial accounts. And then she reached the section on human property. 18 enslaved people, 8 of them children, 6 of those 8 described with the now familiar language. Complexion nearly white, hair golden, features refined and regular. But there was something else. Mixed in with the estate inventory were private letters, correspondence between Robert Harrison and Laurent Savard, dating back 5 years. The letters discussed merchandise, breeding stock, premium offspring, delivery schedules. One letter, dated 1849, was shockingly explicit. "The last batch you sent fetched excellent prices in New Orleans. 3 sold for over $1,000 each, which exceeds our projections. I encourage you to continue the program. With proper selection and management, we should be able to produce 6 to 8 premium children annually across all participating estates." Georgia's hands went cold as she copied the letters. This was evidence. Not circumstantial, not implied, direct proof that this was an organized breeding program designed to produce children for sale based on their appearance. She finished the copying in silence, submitted the work to Graves, and collected her payment. But her mind was racing. Why had Graves given her these documents? Did he know what they contained? Was he testing her? Or did he trust her enough to handle sensitive material without asking questions? A week later, she had her answer. She was working in her room one evening when someone knocked on her door. It was late, nearly 9 o'clock, and Georgia rarely had visitors at that hour. She opened the door cautiously to find William Graves standing outside, looking agitated. "Miss Hayes, I need to speak with you." "May I come in?" Georgia hesitated, then stepped aside. Graves entered, glanced around her modest room, then closed the door behind him. "I gave you those Harrison documents for a reason," he said without preamble. "I needed to see if you'd notice what they contained, if you'd ask questions or if you'd just copy them without reaction." "I noticed," Georgia said carefully. "I thought you would. You're more observant than you pretend to be." Graves sat down heavily. Miss Hayes, I've been processing estate paperwork for Henrico County for 6 years, and for the last 3, I've been noticing patterns. Certain planters, certain children, certain sales. It took me a while to understand what I was seeing, but now I can't ignore it. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to Georgia. It was a list of names, planters, estates, dealers, dates. It matched almost exactly with the information in Georgia's private notebook. "I've been documenting it," Graves said quietly. "Not officially, just keeping records, because it feels like someone should know, someone should remember." Georgia stared at him, not sure what to say. "I know you've been looking into this too," Graves continued. "I've heard you asking questions, seen the way you linger over certain documents. You're careful, but not careful enough to hide your interest completely. Why are you telling me this? Because I found something. Something that proves this isn't just happening. It's been deliberately organized for decades." He reached into his jacket and pulled out another folded document. "Last month, a lawyer in Petersburg died. His offices were liquidated and boxes of old papers got sent to various courthouses for storage or disposal. One box ended up in my office by mistake, and inside it, I found this." He unfolded the document and spread it on Georgia's small table. It was a ledger, not an estate inventory or probate record. This was a private accounting book. The pages were filled with columns, dates, names of children, plantation origins, sale prices, transportation costs, dealer commissions. The entries covered 18 months, from January 1849 through June 1850. And at the bottom of each page, in neat handwriting, were calculations showing the distribution of proceeds, percentages going to planters, to dealers, to intermediaries. This wasn't just documentation of sales. This was profit sharing from an organized business operation. "Where did this come from?" Georgia whispered. The lawyer's name was Charles Winthrop. "He handled estate settlements for several of the planters in your investigation." Graves gestured at the ledger. "I think he was maintaining financial records for the whole network. When he died unexpectedly, these papers got mixed with routine documents and shipped around to various courthouses. Nobody noticed what they were. Except you. Except me." Graves rubbed his face. "Miss Hayes, I have a daughter. She's 8 years old. When I read these records, when I see names and ages written down like they're merchandise, I can't stop imagining her name there. I can't stop thinking about what's being done to these children." "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you've been documenting this longer than I have, and you're outside the system in a way I'm not. If I try to report this, I'll be dismissed or worse. I'm a county clerk. I depend on these men for my position. But you," he hesitated, "you have connections I don't. Free black communities in other states, abolitionist contacts up north maybe. And you're careful, methodical. You know how to move through this world without drawing the wrong kind of attention. You want me to take this information north, to the abolitionists. I want someone to have it. I want someone to know. Even if nothing can be done, even if no laws can be changed, this needs to be documented. This needs to be remembered." Graves stood up. "I'm making you a complete copy of this ledger. It'll take me about a week. Come to my office next Friday evening after the courthouse closes. I'll have everything ready. And then you decide what to do with it. But Miss Hayes, be careful. If these men find out someone's investigating them, that someone will disappear. These are powerful people with connections to sheriffs, judges, legislators. They've built this system carefully, and they'll protect it ruthlessly." Graves left, and Georgia sat alone in her room, staring at the ledger. She'd been looking for evidence, for proof that what she suspected was real. Now she had it. Direct, undeniable documentation of a network that had been breeding and selling children for profit for years. But she also had a target on her back. The moment she took possession of that copied ledger, she'd be holding evidence that could destroy reputations, ruin businesses, and potentially send men to prison, if anyone with power cared enough to prosecute. That week was the longest of Georgia's life. She went about her normal routine, copying documents, attending church, shopping at the market. but every moment felt weighted with anticipation and dread. She half expected Graves to change his mind, or for someone to come arrest her for some fabricated crime. On Friday evening, she walked to the Henrico County Courthouse just as the clerks were leaving for the day. She waited across the street until the building emptied, then approached the side door Graves had told her to use. It was unlocked. She slipped inside, moving quietly through the darkened hallways toward Graves's office. The door was ajar. Light spilled out from the crack. Georgia pushed it open and stopped cold. The office was in chaos. Papers scattered across every surface, drawers hanging open, filing cabinets rifled through. Graves's desk looked like someone had swept their arm across it, sending documents flying, and William Graves was nowhere to be seen. Georgia's heart hammered. Something was very wrong. She started to back toward the door, but a voice stopped her. "Miss Hayes." She turned to find Sheriff Coleman standing in the hallway behind her, flanked by 2 deputies. His face was grave, unreadable. "I need you to come with me." They brought her to a small room in the courthouse basement, not quite a cell, but close enough. Coleman sat down across from her, his deputies standing by the door. "William Graves is dead," Coleman said without preamble. "His body was found in the river this morning. They're saying he slipped on the muddy bank and drowned. Very tragic accident." Georgia felt her stomach drop. Accident. That's what the coroner ruled. No sign of foul play, just an unfortunate drowning. Coleman leaned forward, his eyes hard. "But before he died, there seems to have been some confusion at the courthouse. Files misplaced, documents in disarray. I'm told you were scheduled to meet with Graves this evening." "I've been doing regular copying work for Henrico County. I was supposed to pick up payment for last week's work." "I see." Coleman studied her for a long moment. "Miss Hayes, I'm going to be direct with you. I don't know exactly what William Graves was working on, but I know he was looking into matters that certain people wanted left alone. Important people. People with connections to this courthouse, to the county government, to Richmond's finest families. I'm just a copier. You're more observant than that. And you've been asking questions about certain estates, certain sales. Multiple clerks have mentioned it." He paused. "You've built a good business for yourself here. You have clients who trust you, a reputation for reliability. It would be unfortunate if that were to change." The threat was unmistakable. "I haven't done anything illegal," Georgia said, keeping her voice steady. "No, you haven't, and I'd hate to see your business license revoked on some technical violation. I'd hate to see you have difficulty finding work. Richmond's a small city, Miss Hayes. Reputations are fragile things, especially for free black professionals." He stood up. "All of William Graves's papers have been secured. The courthouse records are intact. There's nothing to investigate. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Good. You're free to go, and Miss Hayes, I trust we won't need to have this conversation again." Georgia walked out of that courthouse and didn't look back. Her hands were shaking, her mind reeling. They'd killed William Graves, made it look like an accident, cleaned out his office before anyone could find whatever evidence he'd been collecting. And they'd warned her, stay quiet or disappear. She went home and locked her door, sitting in the darkness for hours. She thought about her father's advice. Keep your head down. Don't make yourself a target. She thought about the names in her notebook. 137 children, bred like livestock, sold like furniture. She thought about William Graves, pulled from the river with a coroner's convenient explanation. And she made a decision. She wasn't going to stop, but she was going to be smarter about it. For the next 6 months, Georgia did exactly what Sheriff Coleman expected. She kept her head down, did routine copying work, avoided any estates connected to the network she'd been investigating. She attended church, shopped at market, maintained her quiet, unremarkable existence. But privately, she continued her work. She couldn't investigate openly anymore, couldn't ask questions or seek out new records. But she could watch. She could listen. She could continue documenting what crossed her desk naturally in the course of her normal work. And she could communicate with contacts outside Virginia. In November 1851, Georgia received a letter from the free black family in Philadelphia she'd sent her notebook to earlier that year. They'd shared it with members of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, who were preparing a comprehensive report on the internal slave trade. They wanted more information, not names or specific locations, which could endanger her, but confirmation of patterns, estimates of scale, details about methods. Georgia wrote back carefully, knowing her letters might be intercepted. She used vague language, no specific names, no identifying details. But she confirmed what they suspected, that systematic breeding operations existed in Virginia, that they involved multiple planters working in coordination, that children were deliberately produced for sale based on their European appearance, that the trade was extensive and had been operating for decades. She provided one specific statistic. In my work over the past 3 years, I have encountered documentation of no fewer than 137 such children, ages 3 to 11. This represents only estates that have entered probate in the counties where I work. The true number is certainly much higher. Her letter found its way into an abolitionist pamphlet published in Boston in early 1852. The pamphlet discussed the internal slave trade, focusing on the breeding of enslaved people for profit. A section titled "The Trade in Near-White Children" described operations in the Upper South, where planters systematically produced light-skinned children for sale to buyers who prized European features. The pamphlet didn't name Virginia specifically, didn't identify planters or estates, didn't quote Georgia's letter directly, but it described the system in enough detail to cause a sensation. Northern newspapers picked up the story. Abolitionist speakers used it in their lectures. The American Anti-Slavery Society included it in their annual report. Southern newspapers exploded in outrage, calling it abolitionist propaganda designed to inflame passions and misrepresent Southern slavery. The Richmond Enquirer published a scathing editorial. These absurd claims of breeding programs are nothing but Northern lies. The institution of slavery in Virginia is conducted with humanity and Christian principles. That some enslaved people have lighter complexions is merely a reflection of the mixed nature of our population, not evidence of any organized system. But Georgia knew people were reading it. She knew because she started seeing changes. Several planters on her private list suddenly sold their estates and moved to Mississippi, to Texas, even to Brazil. The careful documentation she'd noticed in estate inventories became vaguer. Descriptions like "complexion nearly white" were replaced with more neutral language. The notations "per agreement LS" stopped appearing. The network hadn't ended, it had just gone underground. Georgia continued her quiet work. She expanded her documentation, adding information whenever it crossed her desk naturally. She sent periodic anonymous reports to abolitionist societies, always carefully worded, never with enough detail to identify her as the source. She also continued meeting with Grace, Phyllis, and Sarah. They'd formed a quiet alliance, pooling information about which women and children were at risk, which planters were still operating. The women couldn't stop it. They had no power to intervene, but they could warn each other, prepare, bear witness. In June of 1852, Grace brought devastating news to one of their meetings. "They took Mary's daughter," she said quietly. "The youngest one, Anna. She's 6, light skin, gray eyes. They separated her last week, moved her to the special quarters. Mary's been half mad with grief." Mary worked in the same household as Grace. Georgia had met her several times, a quiet woman in her late 20s who'd already lost 2 older children to sail south. "Is there anything we can do?" Georgia asked, though she already knew the answer. "No. Preston sold her to a dealer 2 days ago. She's probably already on a boat heading down the coast." Grace's voice was flat, controlled. "Mary asked me to tell you something, though. She wanted you to write Anna's name down. In your book, she said, someone needs to remember. Someone needs to know she existed, that she was real, that she mattered." Georgia added Anna's name to her ledger that night, child number 142. Over the next 3 years, she continued her work with grim determination. The Civil War broke out in 1861, and Georgia watched Richmond transform into the Confederate capital. She copied military supply inventories, conscription lists, letters between Confederate officials. The regular civilian work diminished, but occasionally estate inventories still crossed her desk. Even during the war, the pattern continued. Fewer children, certainly. The disruption of war had made the trade more difficult, but they were still there, still described in that careful language, still valued at prices that made no economic sense unless you understood what they were really being sold for. Georgia documented them all. On April 3, 1865, Georgia stood in the street and watched Richmond burn. The Confederate government fled, Union soldiers marched in, and enslaved people walked away from their owners for the first time without permission. She thought about Grace and Sarah and Phyllis, wondered if they'd survive to see this day. 2 weeks later, a Union officer from the Freedmen's Bureau knocked on her door. "Miss Hayes, I'm Captain Thomas Bradley. I understand you have experience with documentation, with records. We need clerks to help register freedmen, track down family members who've been separated. Would you be interested in that kind of work?" Georgia looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to her bedroom, reached into the false bottom of her sewing basket, and pulled out her private ledger. "I have records on 179 children," she said quietly, "sold between 1847 and 1864. I have their names, approximate ages, the estates they came from, the dealers who purchased them. Most went to New Orleans or Charleston. I have descriptions, dates, connections between planters. It's not complete, but it's a start." Captain Bradley stared at the ledger, then at Georgia. "You documented this? During slavery? While living in the Confederate capital?" "Someone had to remember," Georgia said. "Someone had to bear witness." Over the next 2 years, Georgia worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping trace family connections and reunite separated relatives. Her ledger became part of a broader investigation into the internal slave trade. With the cooperation of Union authorities in New Orleans and Charleston, they were able to trace some of the children she documented. Of the 179 names in her ledger, they found records of 43. Some had been resold multiple times. Several had died of disease. A handful had escaped during the war's chaos. 8 were successfully reunited with family members who'd been searching for them. The rest, 136 children, had vanished into the anonymity of the lower South, their true identities erased, their origins deliberately obscured. But they weren't forgotten. In 1867, the Freedmen's Bureau published a comprehensive report on the internal slave trade, including a section on systematic breeding operations in the Upper South. Georgia's documentation formed the backbone of the section. The report estimated that similar programs across Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, and Kentucky may have produced thousands of children over several decades, children whose white appearance made them especially valuable to buyers in the Deep South. The report named 12 Virginia planters as confirmed participants in the network, including several who'd been prominent in state politics. It identified Laurent Savard and 4 other dealers who'd specialized in the trade, and it included testimony from formerly enslaved women describing how the system had operated. The report was controversial. Some northern newspapers praised it as important documentation of slavery's horrors. Southern newspapers dismissed it as Reconstruction propaganda. Several of the named planters sued the Freedmen's Bureau, claiming defamation, though the lawsuits were quietly dropped when attorneys pointed out that the documentation was extensive and factual. In 1868, a journalist from Harper's Weekly interviewed Georgia as part of a story on the Freedmen's Bureau's work. He asked her why she'd taken such risks to document these children when she'd had no way to use the information, no assurance anyone would ever care. Georgia thought about William Graves, found in the river with a convenient explanation. She thought about Sheriff Coleman's barely veiled threats. She thought about Mary's youngest daughter, Anna, sold at age 6 and never seen again. She thought about 179 names written in her careful handwriting over 17 years. Because slavery wasn't just about labor, she said finally. It was about erasing people, making them invisible. These children, they could have passed for white, could have walked free if their mother's status hadn't marked them as property. They were evidence of something people didn't want to acknowledge. So I acknowledged it. I wrote it down. I made sure there was a record. And now, the journalist asked, now they're free, the ones who survived. They're adults living their lives somewhere. Maybe they don't remember where they came from. Maybe that's easier. But I remember. And this, she touched her ledger gently, this remembers. So what was done can never be denied. The article appeared in Harper's Weekly in March 1868. It mentioned Georgia's work only briefly. She declined to give her full name, still wary even 3 years after the war. But the article described her ledger, described the network she'd uncovered, described the systematic breeding and sale of children based on their appearance. The article was widely read. It was reprinted in several newspapers. It became part of the growing documentation of slavery's horrors that emerged during Reconstruction. But in the South, it also generated a backlash. Several former Confederates wrote editorials claiming the whole story was fabricated, that no such system had ever existed, that the Freedmen's Bureau was manufacturing evidence to justify Reconstruction policies. Georgia read these denials with bitter amusement. She had the ledgers, she had the estate records, she had the bills of sale. The documentation was real, carefully preserved, verified by multiple sources. But people who wanted to deny the horror of slavery would deny anything, no matter how well documented. She continued her work with the Freedmen's Bureau until 1870, when funding for the program was reduced and many clerks were let go. By then, she'd helped document thousands of family separations and assisted in hundreds of reunifications. Her contribution was noted in the Bureau's final reports as invaluable. Georgia returned to copying work after leaving the Bureau, but now she worked primarily for black businesses and organizations, churches, fraternal societies, schools. The work paid less, but it was safer. Virginia in the 1870s was becoming increasingly hostile to black political participation, and Georgia had learned to be cautious about drawing attention from white authorities. She kept her ledgers, though. The original notebook, worn and filled with her careful handwriting, stayed in her possession. She added notes occasionally, updates when she learned the fate of a child she'd documented, or when someone came searching for family members who matched names in her records. In 1875, she was contacted by a woman named Catherine Freeman, who'd seen the Harper's Weekly article and recognized details of her own story. Catherine was 28, living in Boston, working as a seamstress. She'd been sold from a Virginia plantation at age 7 and had spent 15 years in New Orleans before escaping during the war. "I don't remember much from before," Catherine told Georgia when they met. "Just fragments. My mother's face, a small cabin separate from the others, other children who looked like me. And then one day men came and put us on a wagon, and I never saw my mother again." Georgia consulted her ledger, tracing through entries from 1854. She found it. Female child, age 7, named Catherine. Pale complexion, blonde hair, green eyes. Chesterfield County, estate of Thomas Winchester. Sold January 1854 to dealer M. Thompson, New Orleans. "Your mother's name was Sarah," Georgia said gently. "She was listed in the same estate inventory. Still alive as of 1854, age 29. I don't know what happened to her after that." Catherine wept. "I didn't know her name. I couldn't remember. After 21 years, I thought I'd never know." They spent the afternoon going through records. Georgia couldn't provide Catherine with a reunion. Sarah's fate after 1854 was unknown, but she could provide information. The name of the plantation, the county, the names of other enslaved people listed in the same inventory who might have known Sarah, might have remembered Catherine. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was memory rescued from erasure. Over the next 15 years, Georgia was contacted by 11 other people who recognized details from the Harper's Weekly article or from Freedmen's Bureau reports. Some were children from her ledger, now adults trying to piece together their origins. Others were family members searching for lost relatives. Georgia helped when she could. She opened her records, shared what she knew, connected people with information. Sometimes it led to reunions. More often it led to confirmation that a loved one had died, or had been sold so many times that their trail was impossible to follow. But even when the news was tragic, people were grateful. "At least I know," one man told her. "At least I know what happened. At least someone remembered." Georgia Hayes died in 1891 at age 70. Her obituary in the Richmond Planet, a black newspaper, noted her decades of work documenting slavery's horrors and helping reunite separated families. It mentioned her ledgers, her contribution to the Freedmen's Bureau's work, her role in exposing the systematic breeding and sale of light-skinned children. In her will, she left her documentation to the Library of Congress, along with a letter explaining the ledger's contents and her methods of investigation. The papers were catalogued and preserved, becoming part of the historical record. Modern historians estimate that the network Georgia documented, 12 confirmed planters, possibly 6 more, operating from the early 1830s through the Civil War, may have produced between 500 and 800 children who were sold through the fancy trade. Georgia's ledgers document 179 of them by name, making her records one of the most comprehensive first-hand documentations of this aspect of the internal slave trade. The children she documented are mostly lost to history now. The majority died without leaving records. Some may have had descendants who never knew their ancestors' origins. A few may have successfully passed into white society, their true heritage forgotten or deliberately erased. But Georgia Hayes made sure that at least 179 of them were remembered. In her precise, careful handwriting, maintained over 17 years at considerable personal risk, she preserved their names. She bore witness to what was done to them. She ensured that even the most deliberately hidden crimes would eventually be brought to light. The ledgers still exist. They're available to researchers at the Library of Congress, fragile pages filled with Georgia's neat script. Names, ages, descriptions, counties, dates. Each entry represents a child who was seen, documented, and remembered, even when the system that enslaved them worked tirelessly to make them invisible. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves uncovering forgotten truths. See you in the next video.